A father's routine drive home takes a drastic turn, unraveling into a tense public confrontation when a cop's suspicions spiral out of control. But just when things seem bleak, one courageous teacher steps in, changing everything. Derek Reynolds gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, stealing a glance at the neatly wrapped gift bag beside him. Nestled inside was a delicate bracelet for his daughter, Kira. Her 9th birthday was tomorrow. He could already picture her face lighting up with joy as she unwrapped it. The day had been exhausting, another grueling overtime shift at the factory, but the thought of her happiness made every long hour worth it. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Westfield, Indiana. Rows of modest homes blurred past as Derek turned onto Willow Lane. Then red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, followed by the piercing wail of a siren. His stomach clenched. He wasn't speeding. His tail lights worked. His tags were up to date. Instinct took over. He eased to a stop at the curb, his mind racing. Rolling down the window, he watched the officer approach, a white man in his 40s, face hardened, one hand resting near his belt. Derek kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his voice measured. "Good evening, officer. Is something wrong?" The officer's gaze swept over the car, eyes narrowing. "License and registration," he snapped. Derek didn't hesitate, handing over the documents. But the officer didn't move, just stood there, staring. The officer's gaze lingered on Derek's face, scanning him as if searching for something unspoken but already assumed. "Where are you headed?" The question came sharp, edged with suspicion. Derek hesitated for half a second. "Just heading home, sir. Picked up a gift for my daughter." The officer's lips curled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Step out of the car," he ordered. A chill ran through Derek's spine. This wasn't a routine stop. He knew it the moment his hand touched the door handle. His pulse thundered in his ears as he carefully stepped out, making sure to keep his hands visible. He had taught Kira what to do in moments like this, not out of fear, but out of necessity. Now, those very lessons replayed in his mind. "Over there," the officer motioned toward the curb, his voice brooking no argument. Derek obeyed, standing in the cool evening air as the officer circled his car, flashlights slicing through the dim interior. Behind him, shadows flickered behind curtains, neighbors watching but not interfering. "Officer," Derek said evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I wasn't speeding. My paperwork is in order. What's this about?" The officer stopped, turning slowly. His eyes narrowed. "You look suspicious." Derek's stomach clenched. He knew those words too well, not from personal experience, but from countless stories just like this. The same script, just a different setting. "We've had reports of break-ins in the area," the officer added. Derek swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. He had nothing to prove. "With all due respect, sir, I've done nothing wrong." The officer ignored him. Reaching into the car, he grabbed the gift bag, tearing it open as if expecting to find something criminal. Derek's jaw tightened, but he held his breath. Around them, a small crowd had started to form, some raising their phones to record. He caught snippets of murmured conversations, uneasy glances exchanged. "Is this necessary?" Derek asked, his voice louder now, cutting through the murmurs. The officer turned sharply. "Keep quiet. Let me do my job." But it wasn't just Derek's voice drawing attention anymore. The officer's actions had awakened something deeper in the crowd. Tension thickened the air, stretching every second into eternity. Derek remained on the curb, heart hammering in his chest, knowing this moment wasn't just about him anymore. The officer continued rifling through Derek's car, the once neatly wrapped gift bag now crumpled on the seat, its ribbon untied, exposing the bracelet meant for Kira. Derek's heart ached at the thought of his daughter waiting at home, wondering why he hadn't returned yet. With a loud thud, the officer slammed the door shut, his flashlight swinging back up, this time, the beam blinding Derek as it landed directly on his face. "What are you really doing here?" the officer demanded, his tone sharp, laced with accusation. Derek held his ground, refusing to let his voice betray any emotion. "I told you. I was picking up a gift for my daughter. That's it. The officer took a step closer, the space between them closing in. So, you just happened to be driving through this neighborhood? At this time of night. He let the words hang in the air, thick with unspoken insinuations. Derek exhaled slowly, aware of the weight of the crowd's eyes on him now. The tension in the air had shifted, curiosity and concern flickering across the faces of onlookers. A woman whispered to her friend, glancing nervously at the officer. A man muttered under his breath, shaking his head. This doesn't look right. Derek met the officer's gaze, steady and unyielding. I live 5 minutes from here. My license has my address. Everything you need is there. But the officer didn't move. His fingers twitched near his hip, brushing against the holster of his gun. Derek's stomach clenched. He raised his hand slightly, palms open, a universal sign of compliance. It was a gesture that felt humiliating but necessary. Don't move, the officer barked. Derek hadn't moved an inch. The murmurs in the crowd grew into a hum of discontent. The energy in the air shifted, tension rising like a slow-building storm. A young woman holding up her phone called out, her voice clear and unwavering. This is wrong. He hasn't done anything. The officer's head snapped toward her, momentarily distracted. Stay back, he barked, his voice still commanding, but something in it had changed. His grip on control was slipping. The cameras kept rolling, their lenses unblinking, capturing everything. Then, a voice emerged from the crowd, steady, strong, cutting through the unrest. Officer, I know this man. Heads turned. A woman in her early 40s stepped forward, her calm presence like an anchor in the storm. She wore a cardigan and jeans, a work badge still clipped to her hip. Linda Palmer. Derek recognized her instantly, one of Kyra's favorite teachers. Kyra had always spoken about her kindness, her fairness. And now, here she was, standing up for him. The officer hesitated, his authority suddenly challenged. Ma'am, stay back, he warned, though his voice had lost some of its bite. I'm not interfering, she said, stopping just a few feet away. I just want to make it clear that this man, Derek Reynolds, is a parent of one of my students. He's not a threat. He's a good man. A ripple went through the crowd. More voices rose, echoing her words. He hasn't done anything wrong, someone shouted. We're all watching, officer, a young woman added, her phone still recording. The officer stiffened, scanning the crowd, his authority slipping through his fingers. What had started as a quiet street was now a sea of faces, all trained on him. Miss Palmer took another step closer, her voice unwavering. If there's no evidence of a crime, I think it's time to let him go. Derek felt a surge of gratitude but kept his expression calm. Thank you, Miss Palmer, he said, his voice steady. But the officer wasn't ready to surrender his control. Not yet. His pride, his authority, it was all hanging by a thread. His jaw clenched as he scanned the growing crowd, their stares weighing on him like 1,000 unspoken judgments. He turned back to Miss Palmer and Derek, his voice sharp but no longer as steady. Step back, ma'am, or I'll have to detain you for interfering with police work. The crowd erupted. Detain her for what? Someone yelled. This is harassment. Another voice cut in. Miss Palmer didn't flinch. I'm not interfering, she said, her voice calm, controlled. I'm standing here as a witness. And so is everyone else. She swept a hand toward the swelling crowd, more neighbors stepping out of their homes, drawn by the commotion. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, his options dwindling fast. His gaze flickered back to Derek, as if searching for some reason, any reason, to justify his actions. But Derek stood tall, his hands still raised, his resolve unshaken. I've complied with everything you asked, officer, he said, voice even. You've searched my car. You've seen my license. What more do you need? Derek's words hung in the air, heavy with a truth the officer couldn't admit out loud. For a long, tense moment, the officer's gaze flickered between Derek, Miss Palmer, and the watchful crowd. The phones aimed at him seemed to multiply, their silent lenses capturing every detail of the scene. The weight of their scrutiny pressed down on him. Then, with a sharp exhale, he took a step back. "You're free to go," he muttered, barely loud enough to be heard over the murmuring crowd. Without another word, he turned on his heel, striding toward his patrol car. His movements were stiff, his pride clearly wounded. Even as the red and blue lights faded into the distance, the tension in the air remained, clinging to the night like a storm that had yet to fully pass. Derek slowly lowered his hands, releasing a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart still pounded in his chest. Miss Palmer turned to him, her expression soft with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Derek nodded, though his voice carried the weight of everything he had just endured. "I will be, thanks to you." A sudden wave of applause rippled through the crowd. Cheers and words of support rose into the night, a stark contrast to the confrontation that had just unfolded. Derek stood still for a moment, letting it all sink in, the fear, the relief, the disbelief. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. What had just happened wouldn't be forgotten. It would spread, through conversations, through videos, through the quiet but undeniable force of a community that had witnessed injustice firsthand. As the officer disappeared down the street, the energy of the crowd shifted. Relief mixed with something else. Something deeper. Anger. Frustration. Determination. People turned to one another, sharing their own stories, their own experiences. The reality of what they had just witnessed wasn't new. It was simply another chapter in a book too many had read before. "This keeps happening," someone muttered. "We can't just let this go," another voice added. Miss Palmer remained at Derek's side, her presence a steady reassurance. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," she said softly, her voice carrying both sorrow and quiet fury. Derek swallowed, his hands still trembling as he reached into his car for the discarded gift bag. The delicate bracelet inside had been meant for Kyra's birthday. Now, it was a painful reminder of a night he wished had gone differently. "I'm just glad Kyra wasn't here to see this," he admitted. "I don't want her growing up thinking this is normal." A young man in the crowd stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I got everything on video," he said. "People need to see what happened here tonight." Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Neighbors exchanged numbers, their determination clear. This wasn't just about Derek. It was about all of them. Discussions about police accountability, systemic injustice, and the urgent need for change filled the night air. What had started as a routine traffic stop had ignited something much bigger than anyone anticipated. Miss Palmer stepped forward again, her voice steady and resolute. "We can't just post this online and move on," she said. "We need to organize. This community deserves better, and so does Derek." Her words struck a nerve. Nods of agreement rippled through the crowd. Derek looked around at the faces of his neighbors, some familiar, others complete strangers. Yet, in his moment of vulnerability, they had all stood beside him. It was humbling. It was powerful. But beneath his gratitude lay a gnawing frustration. Why had it taken all this? A crowd. A camera. A brave witness stepping in. Why did it take so much just to ensure his safety? As the gathering slowly began to disperse, Derek turned to Miss Palmer. "Thank you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." She offered a small smile. "We're all part of this community, Derek. If we don't stand up for each other, who will?" But the true impact of that night wouldn't become clear until the days and weeks that followed. The video captured by bystanders spread rapidly across social media. Within hours, it was being shared by thousands, then tens of thousands. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as both a stark example of police overreach and a powerful display of community resilience. Derek's face was everywhere. His steady composure under pressure became a symbol of quiet defiance. But to him, this wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about something far more personal. It was about protecting his family. It was about making sure Kyra would grow up in a world where her father didn't have to live in fear of nights like this. A few evenings later, as they sat at the kitchen table, Derek explained it to her in the simplest way he could. Sometimes people make bad choices because they don't take the time to see who someone really is, he said gently. But no matter how hard it is, we have to stand up for what's right. Kyra listened carefully, her small fingers tracing the delicate bracelet he had given her. But you were brave, Daddy, she said. And that lady helped you. Derek nodded, his heart swelling. She did. And now it's up to us to help others, too. In the days that followed, the community came together in ways Derek never expected. Neighbors who had once exchanged only polite nods now gathered for meetings, discussing how to address systemic issues while fostering a stronger, more inclusive neighborhood. Conversations that had long been avoided were now happening in living rooms, community centers, and local cafes. At the heart of it all was Miss Palmer. She led the charge, proposing programs to educate both residents and local authorities on bias, accountability, and equity. Her conviction was unwavering. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said at one meeting, her voice steady and determined. But it starts when we refuse to look the other way. Meanwhile, the police department, facing mounting public scrutiny, launched an internal review of the officers' actions. Derek wasn't naive. He knew justice wasn't guaranteed. But the fact that the conversation was happening at all felt like a step forward, however small. For Derek, though, the most meaningful change wasn't in policy, it was in people. The bonds forged that night on Willow Lane hadn't faded. Neighbors who had once been strangers now waved as he passed by, some even stopping to chat, sharing their hopes for a better future. Kira, too, had made new friends, her world expanding in ways Derek hadn't expected. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar yet welcome, cautious hope. One evening, as the golden hues of the setting sun painted the sky, Derek stood in his backyard, watching Kira chase fireflies. Her laughter echoed through the warm air, a sound that reminded him of everything worth fighting for. A knock on the fence post drew his attention. Miss Palmer stood there, holding a small box. "I thought you might like these," she said with a warm smile, handing over the homemade cookies. Derek accepted them with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. He hesitated, then added, "You didn't just help me that night. You reminded me that we're not alone." Miss Palmer's expression softened. "None of us are," she said. "Sometimes, it just takes a moment like that to show us how connected we really are." Derek looked back at Kira, her face glowing with joy, and felt the weight of the past few days settle into something lighter. Because even in the face of injustice, there was power in unity, in speaking up, in believing that change, however slow, however difficult, was always possible. This story isn't just about one man's experience. It's about the strength of community. It's about standing together against injustice. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that spark conversation and inspire action.